Have you ever wondered what makes up the mosaic of a conversation? How gender identity and sexuality are perceived? Or simply, how to change the world for the better? On the program today, we'll be looking at these topics and more. Hello there and welcome. My name is Alex Chan and you're listening to In Theories, a program where we pick fresh ideas from our own backyard. Today on the program, we have regular guest and philosopher Mark Hooper, who will be giving us an idea on how to change the world. Edward Reynolds will be discussing the study of conversations, and Chad Parker will be discussing the deconstruction of sex, gender, and desire. Great to have you all here, and welcome.
Thank you. Welcome.
Let's start with you, Edward. Edward Reynolds has been researching ethnomethodology and conversation analysis. His undergrad was in applied linguistics, and he is currently undertaking his PhD in journalism and communication. He's investigating what our everyday conversations are made up of. Edward, can you tell us a bit about your research? What is ethnomethodology?
Well, ethnomethodology is the study of how people go about producing social actions and social order in their life as you know, and in social life. It comes from the perspective of studying what's observable. So we're interested in looking at behaviour as it's situated in particular contexts, and it's a what you might call a bottom-up approach. So it doesn't have theories, it doesn't have models, and importantly, it doesn't have hypotheses. It, like say the naturalists of Darwin's era, goes out into the world and attempts and just looks at particular instances and particular phenomenon. And describes them in very great detail. In doing that, it looks to pick up how people produce action and produce order in interaction with each other. So, say the doing of producing a radio program. I mean, what are the particular, how we sit in particular chairs? You know, how we orient the headphones. You know, how we orient the mics. You know, where you're sitting and where you're talking. How everything's ordered. And how that sort of comes off as that particular setting or that particular thing. So, you know, a great example of the kind of things that we've studied is, say, how people line up, how people organise a line, how people make accountable that they're in a line. So by accountable, I mean how they show to other people around that they're lining up there. They're not just randomly mooching about. I'm sure all of you who might have gone on campus to the coffee house, what's that name? Mellow, with the confusing line. And it's fascinating to watch there, how people will show that they're lining up or show that they're not lining up and they're waiting for coffee. And how people sort of do that in that very micro detailed sort of way. And how people achieve these sorts of actions is the kind of things that we're interested in. So and there are sort of forms of ethnomethodology and different topics and themes within that, but that's broadly the sort of research program.
And what kind of findings has ethnomethodology made?
Garfinkel, in one of his early sort of ethnomethodological studies, Garfinkel was one of the main proponents of.
It's quite recent as well, 1950s, is that right?
Yeah. So it started in the 1950s. He studied how and why coroners and people in a suicide centre in Los Angeles came to account for a particular person's death as suicide or not suicide, and how they, based on things that people might reasonably know about the world, would sort of attribute suicide to somebody, and how that this was essentially a constructed thing, but that this is, you know, how that functionally everything is a constructed thing. But so how in that particular case, how the coroners and the officers and witnesses and the statements and the reactions that they made all sort of work together to come to find a suicide or not suicide, or the finding that they would have. A branch of ethnomethodology that has become, in many respects, bigger than the original conversation analysis, has studying talk and how people talk as a form of that constructive behaviour. It comes up with findings like adjacency pairs, which is how when you're talking, there are things that initiate action. So asking questions, making statements, and there are things that respond to action. So giving answers or, making denials, sort of responding to things. And how when, in a sort of socially constructed way, people orient to this as needing each other. So if there's a delay in giving an answer, people chase up an answer. They say, you haven't answered my question, and they look for it. If people make an accusation there's no response to it, they'll go ahead and chase that. And vice versa, if you do something that's an answer out of the blue at somebody, they'll expect that there's been a question somewhere. And it's how people how people organise that.
Yeah, can I just butt in and ask a question? Edward, you mentioned that ethnomethodology involved kind of starting with observations free of theory. It's a really interesting idea. I mean, I know very little about the history of science, but I do know that Bacon, who was kind of the first to think of a scientific method, he kind of viewed science in this way, that the task of the scientist was to go about collecting observations. And later there was a bit of a backlash to that, and I know that a lot of modern scientists think that you kind of have to test a hypothesis. You have to have an idea and then go to the world and then see whether it's true. Is it possible? Is ethnomethodology a kind of a return to that mode of thinking? Is it possible to come to the world and only seek observations?
Absolutely. The ethnomethodology was born out of a reaction to functionalist Parsonian sociology, which conceived of the world as structures and went out and proposed to test those structures with sort of indicators. The classic sort of sociological studies you see these days about how many gay men wear pink hats, kind of studies are what they were reacting to. And so they conceived of the idea that there was order at all points, that people constructed this order at all points, and you just had to go out and look for it, basically. And even beyond that, they were interested in how sociologists themselves, and then later on how scientists actually constructed these questions, how they made a study. A great example is studying interviews and how sociological interviews and demographic interviews are situated social events to produce results for the sociologist. And there was actually a study of finding of people doing these interviews. So it's got what's called the program of respecification, which is basically let's look at something different. Let's look at rather than and presupposing that structure's out there and looking for big ways into it. Let's look at the things that are happening, and then watch the patchwork, if you will, of structure appear.
Thanks, Edward. That was Edward Reynolds speaking about the patchwork of social action and social order that make up our lives. We might leave it there and go to a track. We'll be back shortly.